Chapter 4 of Book 3, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. What Caspian did there. Okay, that's Chapter 4. Next morning, the Lord Byrne called his guests early, and after breakfast he asked Caspian to order every man he had into full fighting armor. And above all, he added, let everything be as trim and scoured as if it were the morning of the first battle in a great war between noble kings with all the world looking on. This was all done as he commanded, and then in the 3 boat loads, Caspian and his people and Byrne with a few of his own put out for Narrow-Haven. The king's flag flew in the stern of his boat, and his trumpeter was with him. When they reached the jetty at Narrow-Haven, Caspian found a considerable crowd assembled to meet them. This is what I sent word about last night, said Byrne. They are all friends of mine and honest people. And as soon as Caspian stepped ashore, the crowd broke out into hurrahs and shouts of Narnia, Narnia, long live the king. At the same moment, and this was also due to Byrne's messengers, bells began ringing from many parts of the town. Then Caspian caused his banner to be advanced and his trumpet to blow, and every man drew his sword and set his face into a joyful sternness, and they marched up the street so that the street shook, and their armor shone, for it was a sunny morning, so that hardly anyone could look at it steadily. At first, the only people who cheered were those who had been warned by Byrne's messenger and knew what was happening and wanted it to happen. But then all the children and everyone else joined in because they liked the procession and had seen very few of them. And then all the schoolboys joined in because they also liked processions and felt that the more noise and disturbance there was, the less likely they would have to have any school that morning. And then all the old women put their heads out and of the doors and windows and began chattering and cheering because it was a king after all, and what is a governor compared with that? And all the young women joined in for the same reason, and also because Caspian and Drinian and the rest were so handsome. And then all the young men came to see what all the young women were looking at, so that by the time Caspian reached the castle gates nearby, nearly the whole town was shouting, and where Gumpus sat in the castle, muddling and messing about with accounts and forms and rules and regulations, he heard the noise outside his castle. At the castle gate, Caspian's trumpeter blew a blast and cried, Open for the king of Narnia, come to visit his trusty and well-beloved servant, the governor of the Lone Islands. Now, in those days, everything in the island was done in a slovenly, kind of a slouching manner. Only the little postern opened, and out came a tousled fellow with a dirty old hat on his head instead of a helmet and a rusty old pike in his hand. He blinked at the flashing figures in armor before him. Carn sees efficiency, he mumbled, which was his way of saying, you can't see his sufficiency. No interviews without appointments except between 9 and 10 p.m., second Saturday every month. Uncover before Narnia, you dog, thundered the Lord Byrne, and dealt him a rap with his gauntleted hand, which sent his hat flying from his head. Here, what's it all about? Began the doorkeeper, but nobody took any more notice of him. 2 of Caspian's men stepped through the postern, and after some struggling with bars and bolts, for everything was rusty and not well taken care of, they flung both wings of the gate wide open. Then the king and his followers strode into the courtyard. Here a number of the governor's guards were lounging about, and several more, they were mostly wiping their mouths because they had been eating, came tumbling out of various doorways. Although their armor was in disgraceful condition, these were fellows who might have fought if they had been led or had known what was happening, so this was the dangerous moment. Caspian gave them no time to think. Where's the captain? He asked. Well, I am more or less, if you know what I mean, said a languid and rather dandified young person without any armor on at all. It is our wish, said Caspian, that our royal visitation to our realm of the Lone Islands should, if possible, be an occasion of joy and not of terror to our loyal subjects. If it were not for that, I should have something to say about the state of your men's armor and weapons. As it is, you are pardoned. Command a cask of wine to be opened that your men may drink our health. But at noon tomorrow I wish to see them here in this courtyard, looking like men-at-arms, and not like vagabonds as they look now. See to it on pain of our extreme displeasure." The captain gaped when Caspian said this, but Byrne immediately cried, "3 cheers for the king," said the soldiers who had understood about the cask of wine, even if they understood nothing else, and they joined in. Caspian then ordered most of his own men to remain in the courtyard. He, with Byrne and Drinian and 4 others, went into the hall. Behind a table at the far end, with various secretaries about him, sat his sufficiency, the governor of the Lone Islands. Now Gumpus was a bilious-looking man, with hair that had once been red and was now mostly gray. He glanced up as the strangers entered, then looked down at his papers, saying automatically, "No interviews without appointments, except between 9 and 10 p.m. on second Saturdays." Caspian nodded to Byrne and then stood aside. Byrne and Drinian took a step forward, and each one seized one end of the table. They lifted it and flung it onto one side of the castle, where it rolled over, scattering a cascade of letters, dossiers, ink pots, pens, sealing wax, and documents. Then, not roughly, but as firmly as if their hands were pincers of steel, they plucked Gumpus out of his chair and deposited him facing it about 4 feet away. Caspian at once sat down in the chair and laid his naked sword across his knees. "My lord," said he, fixing his eyes on Gumpus, "you have not given us quite the welcome we expected. We are the King of Narnia." Nothing about it in the correspondence," said the governor. Nothing in the minutes. We have not been notified of any such thing. This is all so irregular. I'd happy to consider any applications. "And we are come to inquire into your sufficiency's conduct of your office," continued Caspian. "There are 2 points especially on which I require an explanation. Firstly, I find no record that the tribute dues from these islands to the Crown of Narnia has been received for about 150 years. "Well, that would be a question to raise at the council meeting next month," said Gumpus. "If anyone moves that a commission of inquiry be set up to report on the financial history of the islands at the first meeting next year, I will also find it very clearly written in our laws," Caspian went on, interrupting him, "that if the tribute is not delivered, the whole debt has to be paid by the governor of the Lone Islands out of his private purse." Well, at this, Gumpus began to pay real close attention. That's quite out of the question," he said. It's an economic impossibility. Your Majesty must be joking." Inside, he was wondering if there were any way of getting rid of these unwelcome visitors. Now, had he known that Caspian had only 1 ship and 1 ship's company with him, he would have spoken soft words for the moment and hoped to have them all surrounded and killed during the night. But he had seen a ship of war sail down the straits yesterday, and he saw it signaling, as he supposed, to his consorts, the other ships. He had not then known it was the king's ship, for there was not wind enough to spread the flag out and make the golden lion visible, so he had waited for further developments. Now he imagined that Caspian had a whole fleet at Burnstead. It would never have occurred to Gumpus that anyone would walk into Narrowhaven to take the islands with less than 50 men. And it certainly was not at all the kind of thing he could imagine doing himself. "Secondly," said Caspian, "I want to know why you have permitted this abominable and unnatural traffic in slaves to grow up here, contrary to the ancient custom and usage of our dominions." Not necessary, unavoidable," said his sufficiency, "an essential part of the economic development of the islands. I assure you, our present burst of prosperity depends upon it." "What need have you of slaves?" For export, Your Majesty. Sell them to Calormen mostly, and we have other markets. We're a great center of the trade." "In other words," said Caspian, "you don't need them. Tell me what purpose they serve except to put money into the pockets of such as Pug." "Your Majesty's tender years," said Gumpus, with what was meant to be a fatherly smile. "You're so young, it hardly makes it possible that you should understand the economic problem involved here. I have statistics, I have graphs, I have—" "Tender as my years may be," said Caspian, I believe I understand the slave trade from within quite as well as your sufficiency. And I do not see that it brings into the islands meat, or bread, or beer, or wine, or timber, or cabbages, or books, or instruments of music, or horses, or armor, or anything else worth having. But whether it does or does not, it must be stopped. Well, that would be putting the clock back, gasped the governor. Have you no idea of progress of development? I have seen them both in an egg, said Caspian. We call it going bad in Narnia. This trade must stop. Well, I can take no responsibility for any such measure, said Gumpus. Very well, then, answered Caspian. We relieve you of your office. My Lord Byrne, come here. And before Gumpus quite realized what was happening, Byrne was kneeling with his hands between the king's hands and taking the oath to govern the Lone Islands in accordance with the old customs, rights, usages, and laws of Narnia. And Caspian said, I think we've had enough of governors. And he made Byrne a duke. You are now the Duke of the Lone Islands. As for you, my lord, he said to Gumpus, I forgive you your debt for the tribute, but before noon tomorrow, you and yours must be out of the castle, which is now the Duke's residence. Well, look here, this is all very well, said one of Gumpus's secretaries, but suppose all you gentlemen stop play acting and we do a little business. The question before us really is, said the new Duke, whether you and the rest of the rabble will leave without a flogging or with one. You may choose which you prefer, but that is the only question here. Well, when all of this had been pleasantly settled, Caspian ordered horses, of which there were a few in the castle, though very ill-groomed, and he with Byrne and Drinian and a few others rode out into the town and headed for the slave market. It was a long, low building near the harbor, and the scene which they found going on inside was very much like any other auction. That is to say, there was a great crowd, and Pug was there on a platform, roaring out in a raucous voice, Now, gentlemen, lot 23, fine Terebinthian agricultural laborer, suitable for the mines or the galleys, under 25 years of age, not a bad tooth in his head, good, brawny fellow. Take off his shirt, Tax, and let the gentleman see. There's muscle for you. Look at the chest on him. 10 crescents from the gentleman in the corner. You must be joking, sir. 15, 18. 18 is bidden for lot 23. Any advance on 18? 21. Thank you, sir. 21 is bidden. But Pug stopped and stared when he saw the mail-clad figures, the soldiers, who had clanked up onto the platform. On your knees, every man of you, to the King of Narnia, said the Duke. Everyone heard the horses jingling and stamping outside, and many had heard some rumor of the landing and the events at the castle. So most obeyed. Those who did not were pulled down by their neighbors. Some of them even cheered. Your life is forfeit, Pug, for laying hands on our royal person yesterday, said Caspian, but your ignorance is pardoned. The slave trade was forbidden in all our dominions quarter of an hour ago. I declare every slave in this market free. He held up his hand to check the cheering of the slaves and went on, Where are my friends? Well, that dear little gal and the nice young gentleman, said Pug with an ingratiating smile. Why, they were snapped up at once. They've been sold. We're here, Caspian, cried Lucy and Edmund together. And at your service, sire, piped Reepicheep from another corner. They had all been sold, but the men who had bought them were staying to bid for other slaves, and so they had not been taken away yet, fortunately. The crowd parted to let the three of them out, and there was great hand-clasping and greeting among them, and Caspian, two merchants of Calormen, at once approached. Now the Calormens have dark faces and long beards. They wear flowing robes and orange-colored turbans, and they are a wise, wealthy, courteous, cruel, and ancient people. They bowed most politely to Caspian and paid him long compliments all about the fountains of prosperity, irrigating the gardens of prudence and virtue and blah, 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 things like that. But of course, what they wanted was the money they had paid already for the slaves. That is only fair, sirs, said Caspian. Every man who has bought a slave today must have his money back. Pug, bring out your takings to the last minim. A minim is the 40th part of a crescent, part of their money system. Oh, does your good majesty mean to beggar me? Whined Pug. You have lived on broken hearts all your life, said Caspian, and if you are beggared, it is better to be a beggar than a slave. But where is my other friend? Oh, him, said Pug. Oh, take him and welcome. Glad to have him off my hands. I never see such a drug in the market in all my born days. Priced him at 5 crescents in the end, and even so, nobody'd have him. Threw him in free with the other lots, and still no one would have him. Wouldn't look at him. Tax, bring out Sulky. And thus Eustace, who they had named Sulky, was produced. And sulky he certainly looked, for although no one would want to be sold as a slave, it is perhaps even more galling to be a sort of utility slave whom no one will even buy. He walked up to Caspian and said, I see, as usual. Been enjoying yourself somewhere while the rest of us were prisoners, have you? I suppose you haven't found out about the British consul yet, have you? Of course not. That night they had a great feast in the castle of Narrowhaven, and then, tomorrow for the beginning of our real adventures, said Reepicheep when he had made his bows to everyone and went to bed. But it could not really be tomorrow or anything like it, for now they were preparing to leave all known lands and seas behind them. The fullest preparations had to be made. The Dawn Treader was emptied and drawn on land by 8 horses over rollers, and every bit of her was gone over by the most skilled shipwrights. Then she was launched again and filled with food and water, as full as she could hold, that is to say, for 28 days. Even this, as Edmund noticed with disappointment, only gave them a fortnight's eastward sailing before they had to abandon their quest. While all this was being done, Caspian missed no chance of questioning all the oldest sea captains whom he could find in Narrowhaven, to learn if they had any knowledge or even any rumors of knowledge of the land further to the east. He poured out many a flagon of the castle ale to weather-beaten men with short gray beards and clear blue eyes, and many a tall yarn he learned in return. But those who seemed the most truthful of all could tell of no lands beyond the Lone Islands, and many thought that if you sailed too far east, you would come into the surges of a sea without lands that swirled perfectly around the rim or the edge of the world. And that, I reckon, is where your Majesty's friends went to the bottom. The rest had only wild stories of islands inhabited by headless men, floating islands, water spouts, and a fire that burned along the water. Only one, to Reepicheep's delight, said, and beyond that, Aslan's country. But that's beyond the end of the world, and you can't get there. But when they questioned him, he could only say he'd heard that from his father. Byrne could only tell them that he had seen his 6 companions sail away eastward, and that nothing had ever been heard of them since. He said this when he and Caspian were standing on the highest point of Avra, looking down on the eastern ocean. I've often been up here of a morning, said the Duke, and I've seen the sun come up out of the sea, and sometimes it looked as if it were only a couple of miles away, and I've wondered about my friends, and wondered what there really was behind that horizon. Nothing, most likely, yet I'm always half ashamed to say that I stayed behind. But I wish your Majesty wouldn't go. We may need your help here. This closing the slave market might make a new world but however, war with Calormen is what I foresee. My liege, think again. I've taken an oath, my Lord Duke, said Caspian, and anyway, what could I say to Reepicheep if we didn't go? And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5, the storm and what came of it. The storm.